Okay. Good evening. Tonight we are very fortunate to have a speaker from the UK, Steve Nichols, G0KYA. He's the author of a book called Stealth Antennas. I'm going to hold it up here. I don't know how well you'll see it on the camera. Maybe you're not. Doesn't seem.
There you go.
Oh, there it is. Yeah, I see. It provides a mirror image of the title. Um, But anyway, it's in its third edition. After you hear Steve talk tonight, if you're interested, it is for sale both at the ARRLL store and the Radio Society of Great Britain. It's available from either source. With that, I will turn the hosting over to you, Steve.
Okay, well, I've got to share the screen first of all, so let's just get that done. And there we go. Right, go back one. Now, can you all see that okay?
Yes.
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 All right, because I've got I can't see the right-hand side because I've got thumbnails of you guys, but never mind. Okay, well, anyway, thank you for inviting me to give this talk. I mean, as I said, Stealth Antennas is the first edition was a bit of a slog, really. It took me about 4 months to write it, but the one thing I did say when I wrote it was that I wasn't going to put any antenna in that book that I hadn't actually tested myself. And that's why it took 4 months to get going. And since then, we've added more antennas as it's done. So now in the third edition, I'm kind of running out of ideas at the moment for stealth antennas, but there are some antennas that I've got in mind for future editions. So it was it was something I enjoyed writing, and it's proved quite popular anyway. So why did I write it in the first place? Well, until recently, I've always lived in houses with fairly small gardens, and I mean, never really had enough space to get say an 80-meter dipole up, a 75, 80-meter dipole, a full 80-meter dipole. So always had to work with compromised antennas, and it was basically, I don't know, 20 years, 30 years of getting it wrong, and playing with different things that prompted it. But we'll move on anyway. I mean, this is not a stealth antenna at all, but this is, I think, what everybody would like to aspire to. But you know, unfortunately, it's getting harder and harder to achieve such an antenna farm, I think. I mean, you've got homeowner association issues, we've got planning permission issues. I think if you put something like that up in your back garden, you're automatically going to get complaints for interference, even when the damn thing's switched off, to be honest. You know, can you achieve the sort of results that you can get with an antenna farm like that? No, probably not. But that isn't the point. The point is, can you have fun, and can you achieve, you know, reasonable results with poor antennas? And I think the answer to that one is yes, you can. But you do have to work at it, and it helps if you've got some sunspots, which is obviously is quite a topic at the moment. The way things are about to change when we start solar cycle 25. So as I said, I've always lived in kind of suburban areas, and I think the one thing I've spotted over the years is that it doesn't get any easier to hide antennas in suburban areas, but the noise levels have gone up dramatically, and that has become a real issue. You know, I remember years ago, you know, you work stuff on 10 meters, and the signal wouldn't even move the meter. But in my last QTH, which we moved from about 2 months ago, you know, you're getting a constant, say, S5 noise level even on 10. And by the time you slid down to 80 meters, it was absolutely atrocious. So, you know, noise is an issue, I think, that is a problem that's not going to go away. But anyway, you I think you have to make do with what you've got space-wise. So I think all of these antennas here, you know, worked for me in one form or another. We'll have a look at some designs of antennas later. But I think when I came across this statement once, it kind of made sense that for a stealthy antenna, you can choose any two of these three parameters, but you can't have all three at once. So it might be small and efficient, but it certainly won't be broadband. Something like a magnetic loop is small and it's reasonably efficient, but it's certainly not broadband. I mean, you get 1 or 2 KCs, or you can have efficient and broadband, but it certainly won't be small. And so, you know, that's the thing, that you can only choose 2 of those in any design. And I haven't yet seen a design that breaks that rule. I've played with lots of things that promise the Earth, but don't necessarily deliver. And we'll have a look at some of those later. And how well does it work? Well, I think one way of testing that before you really start cutting any wire at all, or any metal at all, is to model it. And I use the Emanagel software, EasyNet, as a paid for alternative. But it is a great way of checking antenna designs and to see where your RF is going. And that can give you some real surprises. People say you need an antenna with a low SWR. That's not necessarily true. And I've seen plenty of antennas with low SWRs that do not perform at all. And in fact, if it's got a low SWR everywhere, that's a pretty good indication it's a dummy load. So I do think that modeling the thing with software is a good way to start. And we'll maybe look at some Emanagel examples later. Well, the other question is, what do you want to work? I mean, from the UK, America is northwest from here, the Caribbean's west, South America southwest, and Australia, New Zealand depends on whether we're going long or short path. And I do think that sometimes you can put an antenna up and it will work well in some directions, but not in others. And to get an antenna that will work equally well in all directions is quite tough. The standard quote from one of the local hams here is, a vertical antenna, you know, radiates equally poorly in all directions, which I think is a little bit harsh, but to get a truly omnidirectional antenna is not an easy thing to do. So I think it pays to spend some time with a great circle map and deciding which way you're going to align your antennas to actually work. For example, this was some work I did with somebody recently who had a G5RV that just could not work the States for love or money. And we were sort of scratching our heads about this a little bit. But then we actually modeled it. And as you can see, the West Coast in Canada is actually in a null. All antennas, if they're generally longer than a halfway, do have nulls. And I think that the question is to make sure that the null is not in an area where you want to be able to work. So this is just modeling a vertical antenna against a G5RV. And you can see that it outperforms the G5RV in some directions by up to maybe 10 dB. But in others, the G5RV, north and south there, outperforms the vertical quite successfully. So it's all a case of what do you want to work, and designing the antenna for your particular plot to work those directions. This was another bit of modeling we did for Roger, G3LDI, who lives about 5 miles away from here. He's lucky in that he has a rhombic antenna, not a stealth antenna by any means, and not the sort of thing you could fit into your back garden at all. In fact, if you go there, first time I went to see Roger, I said, "Oh, you've got a ham living next door?" He said, "What makes you say that?" I said, "Well, there's that tower about half a mile away down there." He said, "No, that's the other end of the rhombic." I mean, that gives you some idea how big this thing is. But he did find that the rhombic worked very, very well into central states, but he couldn't work Florida with it, and he couldn't work the northwestern parts of the states either. And when we modeled it, this is what we found, that yeah, there's some massive nulls on the rhombic, and this sort of blowtorch-like radiation pattern. So it worked really, really well into the central states, and probably you guys as well, I would imagine. Yeah, west coast of Canada, California, didn't really want to know. So this is an extreme example of how modeling can prove that you have some issues with your antenna, but I think it shows it quite well. And what's another way of checking for where your thing is radiating, and that's perhaps using whisper. Whisper is a great tool for doing this kind of work. The only problem I would say I would caution on Whisper is just because you're not being picked up in a country, that may be because there's nobody with Whisper, actually in that country or using it in that country. So we tend to forget that and think, oh, it's not doing terribly well into Western Africa. Well, maybe there's nobody in Western Africa with Whisper. But it is a great tool to use, and I've done lots of animations of how Whisper signals are received as the day progresses, and it's a great way of showing how propagation changes on an hourly basis. And we use it with some of the talks here with youngsters getting their licenses to show you how 20 meters progresses across the country or across the world, actually, as the day progresses. So Whisper's a good tool and incredibly sensitive. You don't need to run massive amounts of power with Whisper either. So what about antennas then in general, if we're going to talk about the small antennas or for no gardens or small gardens? Well, we're going to look at 12 designs here, and I'm going to say the pros and cons of each of them. And you can agree or disagree, it's up to you. But this is what I found in particular anyway. I mean, the first one is the Isotron, which is obviously made in the States. It's one of your homemade or homebrewed designs, as it were, from the States. I mean, they are small, they're monoband and lightweight. Do they work terribly well? Well, no, but if you haven't got any space to put an antenna, these things can work, can get you out in a signal anyway. They're basically a resonant circuit. So you have the two panels or what do you call them? Metal plates on the bottom and top. They are the kind of the L, actually no, the C of the LC combination. And then you've got some L, the coil in the middle. So it's an LC resonant circuit that can be made to resonate in the band that you want. And they're a bit weird looking. I mean, you can pretend it's a bird feeder or something if you want to hide it that way. But it's I haven't seen an awful lot in terms of small antennas that can match it really. And I did some tests for a Radcom, the RSGB's magazine over here, and we had an 80-meter version, a 40-meter version. And generally, I found that 80-meter version had a 3-to-1 bandwidth of about 56 kc. So you really needed to decide, well, okay, where do we want to put it? We want to put it in the CW end, or do we put it in the data end, or do we want to put it in the SSB end? And you had to kind of just live in that that zone. The 40-meter one obviously had a slightly bigger bandwidth, but signals were down on a wire antenna of a decent length. But I think that's kind of missing the point really. The thing is, if you can't fit a long antenna, and I think with 80 meters especially, you really need 100 feet to get an 80-meter antenna that works really, really well. I mean, I've played with designs of about 70 feet, and that you do lose performance quite quickly as you reduce below about 100 feet. 100 feet, 102 feet is the same size as a G5RV or W5GI dipole, and they're okay. But if you haven't got room for 132 feet, and 100 feet is going to be better than nothing. And if you haven't got room for 100 feet, then you need to start looking at other designs. And the Isotron certainly helped with that. So I think that they're not to be ignored if you haven't got the space, but don't expect miracles, I suppose. Now, G5RV, I mentioned it earlier. I'm not a massive fan of the G5RV. I know a lot of people seem to rave about them and say that the G5RV, is the best thing since sliced bread, but it isn't. I mean, Louis Varney, who invented it, designed it to be resonant on 20 meters. It was a 20-meter antenna, really. Now, what we also got to bear in mind is they didn't have 10 megahertz, didn't have 30 meters, they didn't have 12 meters or 24 megs, didn't have 17 meters, 18 megs either. So he was trying to design something specifically for 20 meters, and it just so happened as well that it can be used, you know, on 80 and 40 as well. They don't particularly work very well on 10 meters either, but we'll have a look at that in a second. But just to give you an idea, I've got a recording here of contact with J5C in Guinea-Bissau in West Africa. And what I've got to do, you'll start off by hearing it with a signal on the dipole, and then we'll switch to the G5RV, and then we'll switch back again. And what you'll notice is that the signal is very strong on a dipole and just vanishes when we go to the G5RV. So let's have a listen to this anyway, if I can find the pointer. Here we go. This is the dipole. Now we're going to switch. There we go. That's on a G5RV. He just gone, disappeared completely. So we went back to the dipole. And back to the G5RV. He is there if you just listen very carefully. Right. So that just shows you that the G5RV, I think a lot of that was to do with the lobes. The lobes weren't aligned on Guinea-Bissau. But, you know, I'm not a massive fan of the G5RV. They can work for you if you can get them aligned the way you want them to. But this is the other problem with the G5RV, is that these are SWR measurements that were taken at the end of the 30 feet of RG858 coax, and the figures in brackets are at the bottom of the matching section. So you can see that on 80 meters, 75, 80 meters, it's not too bad, and 40 is not too bad. 30 meters, 10 megs is abysmal, over 31 to 1. 20 then comes down okay, not too bad. And then it's a mixed bag once you get above that. And in fact, 28 megs is not a good match at all. What this also shows us is that you see the figures that in brackets at the bottom of the matching section. You'll see that those figures are a lot better. Sorry, the other way around. A lot worse in brackets than the other figures at the end of the coax, because coax masks, the losses in the coax mask the true performance of the antenna. So SWR figures always look much better when measured through a long length of coax, especially something lossy like RG58. So if at all possible, I think if you're measuring SWR, measure it as close to the feed point as you can, and with a decent length of coax. For example, if you put probably 200 feet of RG58 on one of these antennas on G5RV, probably find it's got a low SWR, 1-to-1 SWR everywhere, but it won't perform because most of your current is going to be you know, just cooking up the coax. To be honest, it's just not going to work. Other ways of looking at it is going online and getting something like this, which is a coax loss calculator, and you can see there that on 10 megs, sorry, 10 meters, 28 megs, with a 12.4 to 1 SWR, you put in 100 watts, you're going to only get about less than 50 watts out with a 12.4 to 1 SWR on RG58. So again, it's all about the matched and unmatched loss. And you know, it's very easy to say, well, I've you know, used RG58 on an antenna. The SWR is not fantastic, but it doesn't seem to perform very well. Well, this is probably why. You know, you're losing more than 3 dB, 3.28 or 3.3 dB on a G5RV because of that. I mean, I think if you measured the SWR at the end of that coax, you wouldn't see 12.4 to 1, but that's certainly what was the case with this particular antenna. And as I said, you're putting 100 watts in and only actually getting 46 watts out. So it's something to really watch, I think, what sort of coax you use, and what sort of lengths you use as well. Keep it short and keep it as broad as you can. So more RG213, RG8, and some of the more exotic coaxes that are available now. But keep RG58 away from long lengths anyway. The other thing I like to do with all the antennas I've tested is keep detailed notes on them, because I find that my memory of antennas, it gets a bit blurred over the years, and you think, well, I don't know, that wasn't too bad, was it? So I do tests, SWR tests, and keep a note of those, and on-air comparisons with other antennas as well. I invariably, in my last QTH, I had a set of dipoles up, multiband dipoles, fan dipoles. I'll show you those later. And so I could always compare them with that. And that was kind of like my benchmark to test antennas against. So you could soon see whether an antenna was working better or worse than your reference antenna. But so I'd always make notes on every band, because otherwise you come to it in 6 months' time and you can't remember anything about it at all. Or as I said, you generally remembered it as being a better antenna than it was. Oh, the best antenna you can ever have, by the way, is either the one you've just taken down or the one you're about to put up. It's never the one you've actually got at the time. I've always found that to be the case. Another antenna that we played with a lot in our club here was W5GI mystery antenna, another US invention. About 100 feet long, and it works quite well on 80 and 40, and maybe 20 as well. Not much use much on higher bands than that, but it's reasonably simple to make. It's basically 3 sections of wire, all at about 16'6" long. So you have wire, then you have a coax section that's shorted at one end, then you have wire again. And originally, I think that he had this in mind, the guy who invented it, who's no longer with us, unfortunately, that it actually ended up as they were in phase, but they're not in phase. I think if you try and model this, it's a really hard thing to model. That's why it's called the mystery antenna. But I used one of these for a long time on 80 meters, and it worked okay. It did as well as I think it did as well as a G5RV, if not better. So it's not a bad antenna to play with. And it said if you've got 100 feet to play with on 80 meters, it's the sort of thing you can play with. Okay, let's move to some more commercial designs. Cushcraft R5 vertical antenna. I don't think they make this anymore. I think it's now the R7000, 6000, 7000, that design. And again, this is an example of an antenna that's going to cost you quite a few $100s. Quite a few $100s now. I think they're more like $400 or $500. But actually, performance was about as good as a dipole, generally, and that's a shame. In fact, I did back-to-back tests with another Cushcraft, not the R5. It was the I can't remember what it was now. We'll have, maybe come up later, and it was pretty much dipole-like, or maybe slightly worse than the dipole. Given that you can put up a wire dipole for about $2, it seems like an awful lot of money. But I think a lot of people think that commercial antennas work better than homemade antennas. Generally, I don't think that's the case at all. Oh, it didn't like high winds, but I ended up in the neighbor's garden. I had to go and retrieve it, and but there we go. But vertical antennas are noise magnets, unfortunately, in suburban gardens, especially in the UK. I don't know about the US, but very, very noisy things. And so I'd not to be recommended perhaps nowadays, unless you can get it well away from other wiring in houses as well. Oh, this is the one I was telling you about, the Cushcraft MA5V. I don't particularly like these. I mean, I found when it rained, the SWR changed, and it was down to S points on a dipole on 20, was better on 17 meters and up. But this cost me a contact with Peter First Island down in the Antarctica. So I had this up on the mast when Peter the First was on. I just could not get through with them with this antenna, and by the time I managed to take it down and change it, they'd gone. So I'm a little bit harsh on this antenna because I feel it cost me a QSL card anyway. But there we go. Other designs, the Ribicoff is a very cheap way of getting a multi-band antenna. What it is a 4-to-1 Unnen and either 7.6 or 8.6 meters of wire as a vertical. It needs radials, obviously. It needs radials. There are some losses in the Unnen, and it's better on the higher bands than the lower bands. And they said that these things can work on 40 and 80 meters. A little bit too short, I think, to work on 40 and 80, to be honest. But the 8.61 gets close to working on 40 meters. But again, it's cheap. If you can get a fishing pole, roach pole, I think you call them over there. You know, the only cost really is to build the Unnen and just a bit of wire. I've been a big fan of fishing poles for some time. They're okay for vertical antennas. They're brilliant for vertical antennas. They're not very good because they've got no lateral strength, but they've got vertical strength. They just, you can't use it to support an end of a dipole, say, because they just don't, like, you know, there's no tension in it. You can't, you just pull the damn thing over. But the cheap way of getting a vertical up is a great way of doing it, and you can put it up and down in an afternoon. And that's the other thing I think about stealth antennas, is that you don't have to have up all the time. If you just want to work in a contest, whatever, put it up in the garden when the contest is on, and take it down or lay it down in the garden and put it, you know, until you need it again. Ribicoff, by the way, why Ribicoff? Well, Ribicoff is meant to be Russian for fishing, fishermen. So I found out, and that's why it's called Ribicoff, because it uses a fishing pole. But there we go. I'm sure if someone can speak better Russian than I can, they'll probably correct me on that one, but that's what I found out anyway. Okay, the MFJ magnetic loops. Got a lot of time for these, really. They're better outdoors than in. I have used these mounted in lofts, and they're okay, but it's better outdoors. They are low noise, so a low noise design. The tuning is a real pain. You've only got probably about 2 to 5 kcs of bandwidth, especially at the lower bands. As you go up to 10 meters, you've got more, like 100 kcs of bandwidth. But they do what they say on the tin. They don't, if they're mounted vertically, they don't have to be that high either. Probably about 2 loop diameters up off the ground, just to reduce the ground losses, but they don't have to be at 20, 30 feet. So mag loops, you know, are quite good for people with very little space. The other thing is you really do need to be able to rotate it for 2 reasons. One, to direct the RF in the direction you want it to be directed, and the very odd radiation performance of a magnetic loop, because the radiation is in the plane of the loop, not side onto the loop. But so you need to point it where you want the RF to go. And the other thing is that you can also use them to null noise sources. So if you've got a particularly noisy house in your neighborhood, or even your house, you can rotate it to null out the noise. So I'm quite a big fan of the mag loops. Just
the whole town is men, women, boys, girls, and bets.
Hello, we've got someone joining in. But yeah, they're not bad. They're not cheap. That's the only thing. They're not cheap at all. There are some European designed ones. It's a company in Italy makes them now, but they're even more expensive than the MFJ ones. Okay, Hustler 5BTV, been around for years as a vertical, not bad. Bandwidth's not very good on 80 meters at all. And it's not really the right configuration for working locals on 80 meters. They're okay for DX because they have a low angle of radiation, but they're not very good for inter-G or around the US close working, because the radiation pattern is it's low angle. It's certainly not NVIS or near vertical incident skywave radiation. The other thing is you need radials, ground radials, and lots of them to make them work. I think that the problem with verticals like this and the button up is that you can stick a pole in the ground, you can stick the antenna on the pole, you can measure the SWR and find it's actually quite low, and you think, well, there you go, that's fine, that's brilliant. Well, what you're doing is these things have a natural impedance of about 32 ohms. And what you're actually seeing, if you see a 1-to-1 SWR, is you're seeing 32 ohms of its natural impedance, and the rest is losses. And what normally happens is as you add more and more ground radials to these things, the SWR appears to go up, which confuses some people. So they stop adding more radials. Well, no, just keep adding radials to it until the SWR doesn't change at all. And you'll end up with an SWR of about 1 to 1.4. But that's working well then, that's the thing. But if you're seeing a 1-to-1 SWR on a Hustler, chances are you haven't got enough radials on it. Rudy Sevens in the US has done an awful lot of work. Sen6LF has done a lot of work on radials for verticals, and his stuff is worth reading. I mean, basically concludes that, you know, more shorter radials are better than fewer longer ones, but it's well worth reading his stuff, N6LF. Done some very, very good work on radials. So that's the Hustler. And again, in the tests I did with dipoles versus Hustler, basically the chart on the right, if I heard a station, you know, I would compare it between the Hustler and the dipole, and the ones in green are where the antenna that heard it better. So you'll see that there's probably more green in the dipole chart or dipole column than in the Hustler column, but there were times that the Hustler actually did outperform the dipole. But there we are. And I've got an example here. I've got a recording. This is W1AW on 40 meters in a contest, actually, I think. And you'll notice that we're going to go between the 5 BTV and a dipole, and I can't tell the difference. Let's see if you can tell the difference, but see what you think. Yeah, couldn't really see any difference on that at all, but there we go. So again, just to recap on verticals in general and the Hustler for 5 BTV in particular. So if your SWR is 1-to-1, could be a sign it's not working properly. Ground radials that you put on the ground don't have to be resonant radials. Once you put a radial on the ground, it becomes non-resonant. It becomes detuned by the earth. So cutting your radials to be resonant and then laying them on the ground is a bit of a silly way to do it. So you need to put as many radials down as you can. And what you notice on the charts is that the first few radials you add makes a hell of a difference to the radiation performance. Then it kind of tails out. Above about 32, you're probably only going to see about 1 dB difference, maybe 1 or 2 dB difference between 32 and 128 radials. So I would say that if you aim for 32, and how long should they be? Well, as long as the antenna is tall, let's put it that way. So with a Hustler, maybe 26 feet, 32, 26 feet radials on a Hustler 5 BTV would probably be about as good as you could get. Yeah, if you can put more radials down, sure, do it, but you probably won't see much of a difference in performance. And I think Rudy Sevens concluded that it was easier to use lots of shorter radials for a given length of wire than fewer longer radials. But there we go. And don't cut it to achieve resonance. I mean, these things are quite difficult to tune, but don't take a hacksaw to it. Certainly play with the traps if you need to adjust them. But I don't think that taking a hacksaw to it would work terribly well, to be honest. It's not good. And as I said, they can be noisy. All verticals are noisy, and not necessarily a good idea nowadays in suburban environments. Now we're going to look at some really cheap and not nasty, but antenna designs. W3EDP 84-foot long wire is one of them that I've played with in the past. 84-foot wire against a 17-foot counterpoise. The only trouble is nowadays that if you are running one of these and your ATU is right next to you in the shack, the RF, maximum RF, is in the shack next to you, and you find that it's going to, you know, your USB connections are going to disconnect, and your mouse can stop working and things like that. So it's not a good idea. The better way to feed these is to feed them somewhere else, from somewhere else, with a remote ATU. But NFEDs that are fed from the shack operating position, not a good idea, I don't think. And I'm talking about 100 watts here, not talking about kilowatt. I think that would be asking for trouble, big trouble, if you're doing that. They're a bit noisy. They're good on 80, 40, and 20, less so on higher bands. But in terms of cheapness, if you've got some form of ATU, you can't get much cheaper than an 84-foot long wire, I don't think, to be honest. Now, why 84 feet? This is interesting. Well, it was chosen, the length was chosen, so it was offered a low impedance. That is an easy match on the most bands. And if you look at where that blue line comes down, that's the 84-foot length comes through that chart there. It's basically a length that is neither a quarter wave on any particular band, and neither is a half wavelength. Half wavelength would be a high impedance feed, like 2,500 ohms feed, but it isn't a half wavelength on any particular band. So it's easy to match. I think that's the good point to make about this. That 84 feet is a good length and easy to match with a pretty normal ATU. This is an example of when I first moved to my last house. The W3EDP was the first antenna I put up. I just threw it over the roof to just get going till I could sort something else out. And I found that using Amarnagal to model it, it showed that it should work slightly better than the G5RV at lower angles, as I found. But what I did find is I couldn't work south. I couldn't work anything south of the QTH, sort of Italy in that kind of neck of the woods. It was really poor. But then when I modeled it, I found that this was probably why. This is the antenna plot, and that big lobe coming off there. Oh, it's not actually, the lobe was actually pointing south, beg your pardon. It was south I could work fine. I couldn't work north. I couldn't work Norway. And this lobe that came out at the bottom worked really well in that one direction, but there was nothing else. And you'll notice there's this massive high angle lobe there as well. So it worked okay, but on 17 meters, you don't want a high angle lobe like that. You're never going to get NVIS radiation. Never going to get a sky return on 17 meters like that to work around your locality. 80 meters is fine, but not on 17. So again, this is an example of how a program like Amarnagal or EasyNet can actually let you know why your antenna is not working the way you'd like it to work. So if you wanted to set up an antenna to work one particular part of the world on 17, this is probably the way to do it. And you just need to make sure that lobe at the bottom there is pointing at the right place. Okay, we're moving on now. So inverted Vs with fishing poles, yeah, they can work quite well. Monoband antenna, or you can parallel feed it with multiple dipoles off the same feed point. And as long as they're separated, you don't get too much interaction. But this was a setup I used to use for some contests, whatever. I think I had a 15-meter dipole and a 20-meter dipole and a 10-meter dipole off the same feed, and it worked reasonably well. And it's very easy to put up, very simple to make as well. So I'm quite a good fan of inverted Vs, and the fishing pole could take it. And the thing is that the wire that you're using actually works as a support for the pole. So it's actually like a guy wire, really. So that can work quite well. This was another design that is in the Stealth book for a fan dipole that goes in the loft or attic. space, and I had this for years. And it uses a couple of ideas there. It uses a zigzag loading for the 40-meter dipole that went up and down, up and down, up and down the roof. And then the other dipoles, there was a 17-meter dipole and a 20-meter dipole and a 10-meter dipole. And the thing was to separate them out so that they weren't too close together. And it worked quite well. I actually worked T32C, Christmas Island, Kiribati, I think, with this on 10 meters, last sunspot maximum. So I was quite chuffed. And then you can actually extend this. You could actually put 40-meter traps at the end of the 40-meter run and zigzag it across to get onto 80 meters. Would it be a big performer? No, not really, but it would get you on the band if you had no space to do it at all. The only thing I would say about putting things in the loft, nothing wrong with that, except A, they're a little bit noisy because you've got another house noise, and two, watch how much power you're running. I mean, maybe 25 watts, 50 watts on a good day, but much more than that, you're going to cause some issues with your TV interference and hi-fi interference. My kids never told me that. It was 2 years later I found that every time I operated CW on this thing, I blotted out their hi-fis in their rooms, but they daren't tell me. So it's the way it goes. Yeah, if you can keep the power down, if you're a QRP operator, it's fantastic, and nobody would ever know that you're on the air. And it's totally weatherproof as well, so you can do antenna work in nighttime in the loft, and nobody ever knows you're even doing anything. So I was quite a big fan of that. I don't know where we've moved to now. This place, we don't have a loft, so I'm rather stuffed with that now. So just to recap on the multi-band fan dipole, so it's suitable for SWL, shortwave listeners, QRP. I said it's an M6 license here. That's basically a kind of foundation license we've got for 10 watt operators in the UK. PSK and FCA operating, yeah. Occasional use up to maybe 50 to 100 watts, I said, but certainly no linears. That would cause you grief, massive grief. Uses non-inductive zigzag loading, and a feed point balance, quite important here. That reduces the RF pickup and help it make it a little bit quieter, definitely. So totally stealthy and totally weatherproof. So I was a big fan of multi-band fan dipoles in the loft. Okay, just the last few ideas now. This was design that I came up with a few years back, which is a monoband end-fed half-wave antenna. It's my blogspot site, G0KYA.blogspot.com, has got some designs for this. What is it? Well, this was a 20-meter one, and this little box of tricks here, you've got a tuned circuit for 20 meters, and the black thing that you can see there is a piece of coax. We used the coax as a capacitor, and this was to keep the price down and to make it easy to make. So it's a tuned circuit for 20 meters, and with a capacitor cut to make it resonant on 14 megs. And but basically plug a half wave of wire into that. Works really, really well. It's quite a performer actually. Monoband antenna, but it works really well. We used to use it in International Marconi Day. We do a station from Caister lifeboat on the east coast here, and we use this as our main antenna, and it works very, very well indeed. Very good performer, so we're quite chuffed with that. In terms of power handling, it probably take about 100 watts. Wouldn't take much more than that, I don't think, but it works quite well. Multi-band end-fed half-wave antennas, a big fan of them as well. In fact, the main antenna I've got here now is a 132-foot end-fed half-wave with a multi-band matching unit at the bottom. This was an example of how, as I said, you could get an antenna for 80 meters in less than 100 feet. This was, I think it was 65 feet to this coil, and then about another 2.5 meters or yards, so about 7 feet beyond the coil. And it would get you on 80 meters, but they're quite narrow in the bandwidth, and it's not a massive performer either. So it is quite good. It was down about 2-3 S points on 80 meters. But again, that's described on G0KYA.blogspot.com as well. And you're very lucky in the States that you've got a guy called Steve Ellington, who's done an awful lot of YouTube videos about multiband end-fed half-wave antennas. And he's really gone into it. He's worked out the best toroid cores to use, and lots of work he's done. And his videos are worth looking at. So this is a multiband end-fed half-wave tuning unit, or toroid. This is the 49-to-1 Unen, basically, but with 2 bifilar turns at the beginning, followed by 14 turns to give you the 14-to-2 or 7-to-1, which then works out at 49-to-1. So because it goes as a square of the turns ratio, so 49-to-1. And you have a little capacitor, 100 puff capacitor, which you can get off eBay for virtually nothing nowadays. And that helps its performance as well. It's just a case of getting the right toroid material, really. FT240-43 ferrite toroids are probably cheap and do the job. You can use, I think it's 61 material with a couple of toroids, but they're about 3 times the price. So depending on what bands you want to work and how much power you want to run, you need to pick the toroid material to suit. So as I said, Steve Ellington's got some very, very good videos on this kind of thing, which is good. A lot of work was done in the Netherlands on these as well. And you can see myantennas.com. It's a guy in Florida, lives in Florida, and he sells these things worldwide, and that's where mine came from. But if you check PD7MAA's website, he's got some of the multiband designs on there, and Steve Ellington's videos as well. And you can add a compensation coil as well. So 5 turns on a 1.5-inch former at 79 inches from the feed point. What that does is, the trouble is with these, if you kind of set it to be resonant about, say, 7.1 megahertz, then you think it would be resonant then on 14.2. And as you go up the band, you find it slowly gets the SWR midpoint or low point. It's not quite where you want it to be. You can add a compensation coil that has very little effect at the lower bands, but it does have an effect on the higher bands. So it brings the SWR down into the correct resonant point where you want it. So that's good. So yeah, the 52 mix toroids are harder to source and more expensive, but the 240-43s are quite easy to get hold of and quite cheap. So you can play with a number of toroids and the toroid type to get the design. We're nearly there now, I think. So off-center fed dipoles is another great design that works. So if you take a half-wave dipole cut for 80 meters, break it at the 1/3, 2/3 point, feed it with a 4-to-1 balun, you now have an antenna that will work on 80, 40, 20, and 10. So you get a lot more out of the antenna, a lot more bands out of one antenna than you would think. Current thinking on balance is that the balun has to be man enough for the power levels you're running. Generally 100 watts isn't a problem, but I think if you're running a kilowatt, you really got to think hard about how big your balun is, otherwise you'll cook it. And you need to pick the right material, as I said. So a 240-43 might be okay, a ferrite balun, but you might need 240-61 if you want to go for a little bit more power. To build an effective GOKYA balun, you actually need to have 2 cores to separate the cores out. So basically you wind the 2 cores, you connect one end in parallel and the other end in series, and that's how you get 4-to-1. A lot of commercial baluns, cheap ones, you'll see they're all wound on 1 core. It's not really a good way to do it. To build a good one, do it on 2 cores, and then, as I said, parallel one end and put the other in series, and that works a lot better. Another trick you can do with offset fed dipoles is move the feed point. This is a graph of a 40-meter off-center fed dipole or Windham antenna, and you'll see the yellow trace there. That's the conventional 1/3 to 2/3 feed point. And yes, you get 7 megs, you get 14 megs, and you get 28 megs out of it. But if you move that feed point to the 41.1% point, you suddenly find that you can get 15 meters out of it as well. And the SWR is reasonable. They're all about the same. There's not much difference between these two, but it means you can get another band out of an off-center fed dipole. So the conventional 1/3, 2/3 feed point is not really optimum, I don't think, with off-center fed dipoles. So if you can feed it at a different point, you'll get more bands out of it. So it's another way of getting more, it's all about getting as many bands as you can out of an antenna, I think, in the, because we haven't got space for loads of antennas, so you need to get as much out of an antenna as you can. So finally then, just what have we learned then? Well, I think single band antennas work better than multi-band antennas. I think generally that's true. Don't underestimate the half-wave dipole, definitely. I think it is underestimated, but we use it as a benchmark, and I think you can see why. Get your maximum current point as high as you can if you're using dipoles. If you're using a ground-dependent vertical, use lots of radials as well. You can parallel feed dipoles, but the only way to get it to work is to actually keep the wires apart. I saw a design once which was a multi-band dipole, but all the wires were bundled together, and it had a low SWR, but it was deaf as a post on the higher bands. Keep the wires apart and feed them, separately. Feed them out so that they're nowhere near the other legs of the dipole, and it will work a treat. And you can lose about 0 to 2 S points using loft-mounted antennas, but if you haven't got space for anything else, it's fine. Just watch your power. Don't run 100 watts, and certainly don't run a linear. You end up with a fire if not. And as I said, you'll find lots of designs for antennas and things I've played with at G0KYA.blogspot.co.uk. And at that point, I think just open up to any questions, I think.
Well, Steve, thank you very much. And if anyone has any questions, they can just unmute and ask them. I have a quick question before I let everyone else get started, though. Actually, in one comment first, I'm not sure if you were aware, Mr. Windham was actually an Ohio native, and he was actually born in Gallipolis, which is on the southern border of Ohio, and then he spent most of his time in Columbus after that. So the question I had was about the multiband EdFed antenna on the half-wave. That extra coil, is that the same little coil that's on my antennas, the little gray?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's I think it's about 5 or 6 turns. That's all it is on about a 1-inch former, and it's mounted at about as a 76 inches from the feed point. And what it does is it basically just brings the low SWR points down a little bit on all the higher bands. Because if you don't have that, you'll find that by the time you get up to 28 megs, the low SWR point will be about 28.8 megs, which is a little bit too high. But just that little compensation coil there just drags it down on all the higher bands, so that it ends up a little bit better all round. And it was, I can't remember the guy's name now. You probably remind me, the guy at My Antennas. It was his design. I've never seen it anywhere else, and I think everyone's copied it now, which is a bit of a shame for him. But it does make a big difference. So the thing about the EnFed half waves, I think the great thing about the EnFed half wave is that it's had a lot of research over the years now, and we've gone from the monoband ones to the multi-band ones. The Dutch, the Netherlands, Hams did a lot of work on it, and then he took it and developed it even more. So we now got the capacitors that are in the tuning box, which helps a lot with matching, and the compensation coil as well. And the one I've got here is 132 foot long. It works on 80, 40, 30. Well, it works on all the bands actually. It's got an SWR below 2 to 1 on all of the amateur bands. I think it's fantastic, and quite a performer as well.
And I've sent in the chat message, I've sent out links to your blog spot and to the My Antennas website. So if anyone wants to go to the chat, they can find those links and copy them.
Okay.
I have
Next
a question.
question.
I have a question.
Go ahead,
Okay.
Pat.
I run a 6BT, the Hustler.
Yeah.
How much of a difference is there between what you were describing and my 6 here? Because it seems like I have, you mentioned a couple of the idiosyncrasies of that antenna, and it seems like stuff that I go through also.
Yeah, I mean, the basic difference between the 5BTV and the 6BTV is you've got 30 meters, 10 megs on it, haven't you? But you don't have to have the capacity hat that the 5BTV's got. So it's more of a vertical just with the traps on it. But yeah, they're very good. I think that they're quite difficult to tune. I think you have to tune them one band at a time, and don't mess around with the traps too much. But again, it's all down to the earth really on a vertical. And I think
I have noticed. I have noticed. I'm only running about. I think I have 26 radios on there. I'm gonna have to put more on.
Yeah, yeah.
But, that's one thing I did pick up on.
Yeah.
It's not been a bad antenna. It seems to hear okay, but
yeah,
it does have its issues. And at the 80 meters part of it is where I'm having the biggest issue with it.
I think that the trouble with verticals on 80 meters is partly that they've got very, very narrow bandwidth, but partly that the radiation is just not where you want it. Basically, around the UK especially, we need high angle radiation for near vertical instant skywave, and you don't get much high angle radiation off a vertical, and so it's probably the worst antenna design, a vertical antenna for working around the locality. You know, once you get out to 1,000 miles or so, the angle comes the radiation angle that you need for that, it comes down quite a bit. But if you're trying to work out within a 200-mile radius of your QTH, probably the worst antenna you could have for 80 meters is a vertical antenna, and that's just a fact of life, unfortunately.
Fortunately, I have an alpha delta that I'm running. Other than that, it's in an inverted V.
Yeah, and I would imagine it outperforms the Hustler amazingly.
Yeah, actually it does.
Yeah,
hands down, pretty much.
Yeah, that's partly due to its bandwidth and partly due to its radiation pattern, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Steve, this is Jim, WA3JAT. I'm the guy that recruited you to speak in the middle of the night, your time. I hope you don't mind, but we certainly.
That's okay.
I have a couple of questions for you. One is not antenna related. One is, I'll ask you the one that's not antenna related. I did enjoy your cover on your book, Stealth Antennas, and noticed sort of the For Your Eyes Only and Most Secret. Are you a James Bond fan?
No, I didn't design that. That was the designer at RSGB. Basically, if ever, they ignore any design I come up with, so they went to him for the 3rd edition and said, right, we want something different. And I can't remember his name now, but he came up with the idea. And when I saw it, I said, yeah, I quite like that. It's good. So I actually had lunch with him about 2 years ago and congratulated him. I thought it was a good idea. But yeah, it wasn't my idea.
Okay, well, I was going to give you credit for that.
No, it's not me.
I do love the movies. They're not realistic, but they're great entertainment. The question I had on antennas, I did not see, and I hope I didn't miss it in there and going through your book. I didn't see anything in there on the buddy pole, which is a fairly popular portable antenna here in the US. My own experiences, I found them about on par. I've used the super antenna vertical and found them about the same type of performance, at least for me. But is that one of the antennas you're thinking of adding to future edition?
I think the book has the MP1 antenna in it, which is a similar kind of thing. And that was a super antenna MP1, I think it was. We did some tests with that. Not that impressed by it, really. It was okay. But I think that the point I would make really is that it's going to be down. The performance is going to be down on a dipole, and you don't really want that. especially if you're running QRP. Yeah, and that really bugs me. I think that we get a lot of new hams here who are running with 10-watt licenses, and so they buy a commercial antenna that is definitely going to be down. It's got, you know, negative gain, as it were, or, you know, it's going to have a performance in the negative dB rather than the positive dB, and so you're really struggling. Oh, they generally now, modern hams don't have access to CW, especially, well, in the UK they don't. So they're trying to use SSB with 10 watts into a poor antenna, and I think that's probably the most frustrating thing you can do, to be honest. So yeah, the buddy pole, I've not played with a buddy pole exactly, but certainly shortened vertical antennas, that, you know, portable antennas, certainly they're in the book, and we didn't get on too well with them. The only place we did find that worked really well with the MP1 was the beach, because you then get tremendous gain by operating close to saltwater's edge, and that can work for you then. Actually, I don't know how you guys are quite a long way from the coast, aren't you?
Yeah, we're Midwest area.
Yeah. We have done some work here, and it makes a hell of a difference. Just getting that to the water's edge, it makes a hell of a difference. We worked, we're working a guy in Australia, 5'9" both ways, but when we came inland about another 500 feet, it'd gone completely. So yeah, that was interesting.
Yeah, well, one of the reasons I use the buddy pole, I like to operate from parks sometimes, and I've probably had better experience with the PAR end fed antennas. I like them very well.
Yeah.
But they tend to get ouchy, park rangers, when you start throwing wires up in trees.
Yeah.
And at least with the buddy pole, you can put it on a mast and lift it up, and you're not interfering with any of the natural aspects of the park. They don't tend to get quite as upset.
Yeah. Do you know, the best antenna you can ever have is the one you actually use. So if you've got something and it works for you, then use it. Absolutely. Yeah. I think that yeah, parks. I mean, we didn't do much work. There's a video on my site of me and Jim Bacon. We did a kind of a Parks on the Air type event up in the North Norfolk coast. That was about 3 years ago. But of course, with the COVID-19, we weren't able to do anything this year at all. And it's a real shame. And you know, we want to get back to doing that next year, I think. Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks for answering my questions, and thank you very much for an excellent presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions of Steve?
So Steve, I'm the editor of the newsletter, and I was hoping to get your permission to grab some of the stuff off your website and put it in our newsletter, if that's all right.
Yeah, feel free. Yeah, wherever you want.
All right, thank you. As for antennas, I have to say, I have dipoles, I have a flagpole, and I have this little I have this little thing. It's a tactical antenna. It works. It's not perfect. It's a vertical. It's got a couple of issues, but in a pinch, I get out. And my point is, it's like everything's a compromise. If you can get a contact, it's worth it.
Yeah,
it's like
exactly.
I lived in an HOA. I lived in an HOA and I put up a vertical. They couldn't see it. As long as they couldn't see it, I was legal. And it was like 33 foot of vertical aluminum, but it was whatever I could get to get out.
Yeah,
so
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Your presentation's excellent. And by the way, I ordered your book.
Oh, that's very kind. Thank you. Yeah, I think the book was really trying to show that there was no such thing as, you know, no room for an antenna. It had examples. I basically put requests out on reflectors when I wrote the first one and said, like, show me, you know, if you're in a compromised situation, show me what you use and tell me how you get on with it. And you know, lots and lots of people got back to me, and it, you know, ranged from one guy, I can't remember his call sign now, but he basically had a set of Isotrons in his house, in one room, and he worked the world with that. And you know, another guy, he had a magnetic loop for a top band that he'd produced in the garden that worked really, really well. And you know, there were so many stories, but the most important thing was that they were all using them and enjoying them. You know, and I think that's the important thing. If you've got room for a beam and a mast, by all means put them up. But if you can't do that, I think the thing is, and it's going to get better now. We're now at just the beginning of Sunspot Cycle 25, and you know, already we're seeing signs of improvement over the last month or so. And I think, you know, when you get to the stage where you can work around the world with 5 watts to a dipole on 10 meters, then you do wonder, why do you need anything better? And it will come. I think we've, you know, like everything, we've had sunspot minimum that seems to have gone on for, you know, way too long, maybe 3 years. And I think once the sunspots start playing again, everyone will have some fun with it, to be honest.
Well, Anthony and I have worked the guy in Australia and the guy in Yukon. And it's like Anthony has the beams and I just had wires in the backyard. And it's whatever it takes to get out.
Yeah.
And it's always a compromise. And I said that, but it's like, just get on there and call CQ, if you will.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Absolutely. Yeah, good.
I think one thing, when you were talking to Pat a little earlier, Steve, about his vertical, the fact that he has that other alpha delta dipole is a good thing for you to do around here. If you want to be able to make close in 80 meter and 40 meter contacts, if you do have a vertical and you can still put up a small dipole, you'll probably have better results for your local contacts with that dipole. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a fact of life, unfortunately. I mean, 40 meters has not been terribly good for NVIS close-in stuff, but that will improve as well with sunspot numbers going up. We'll start to see, you know, you'll be able to make contact out to sort of 200 miles on 40 meters, whereas it's been more like 500 miles, I think, with the current state of the ionosphere. But yeah, you're absolutely right. You know, if you can combine the two, you know, vertical and low dipole somewhere, probably works well for you. Yeah. You can never have too many antennas.
That's unless you ask my wife.
Well, yeah. I think we all suffer this. It's compromise, but you know, wait till they go shopping, then put them up.
Well, I've actually put a few antennas in my attic at times, not because I couldn't put them outside, but just because the house already looked enough like a porcupine.
Yeah. It's not a pretty hobby, is it, really?
Well, to us they are, but not to anyone else.
No. My wife was cutting the grass today because the weather been quite good, and she suddenly came in and said, "What the hell's all this wire doing on the floor?" And there's an experimental end-fed half wave, and I'd finished with it, so I just left it laying on the grass, and she was going to go over with a mower, so I got in trouble today. Never mind.
Well, at least you caught her before she did it.
Yeah, it was a close run thing, I think, to be honest. Yeah.
Wasn't that called SAF, spouse approval factor?
Yeah, she's pretty good. She lets me make a right mess wherever we go. But yeah, that was my fault. I'd just taken it down and rolled it up and left it on the garden. But I shouldn't have done that. That was silly. Yeah. Good. Any more questions?
Yeah, it's just real quick one. And first, thank you for taking a very late evening to produce to present an excellent presentation. This was just packed full of knowledge, and I'm going to go back and rewatch it 2 or 3 times to make sure I get everything out of it. Have you done any? There's very little information in the literature. Have you done any research on end-fed inverted V antennas? That is the almost symmetric pattern of an inverted V, and yet the convenience of an end-fed point near the ground on one end?
Yeah, I mean, the radiation pattern shouldn't be any different to feeding it in the middle, to be honest. I mean, if you play with it in Marnagal, it's just the end-fed point is just a high impedance point. So it really makes no difference to the radiation pattern at all. It's only the way you're feeding it. Inverted V's are good in that generally they are more omnidirectional than half-wave dipoles. What you find is that as you bring the levels down, the side lobes kind of shrink, but you don't get those massive nulls that you get off the end of the wire. And it's worth playing with a modeling program to see that. But truly, the fact it's an end-fed half wave makes no difference to the radiation pattern at all. It's just feeding it at the high impedance point instead of the low impedance point in the middle. But the radiation pattern will be the same. So it's worth playing with it to see it. But yeah, generally, I think with inverted V's, you don't get the strong lobes that you get. They generally shrink a bit, but you do get some more radiation off the ends of them. So it's a good way of making it a little bit more omnidirectional.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hey, Frank, my antennas in their FAQ, there's a link where he's modeled it in different ways he's put it up, and you can compare the straight from an inverted V and an L in there as well.
Very good. Appreciate that. Thanks.
Good.
Okay, I think we've run out of questions. Again, thank you, Steve, for spending the late night with us, and hope it was as fun for you as it was for us. Thank you.